You see, right before he died, he was on his way to Washington for something called the Poor People's March, I believe, the Poor People's March. And you're going to hear, there was a absolutely amazing kind of a documentary on NPR that told the story of how he wanted economic equality, how he pushed for people to use things like strikes and boycotting, not just for the vote or for the bus or for the segregation, but for the people who worked in sanitation. I believe in Tennessee, for the people who worked in any industry in Mississippi and weren't being paid enough. How he had an agenda for America to use its wealth to heal its people, to use its wealth to heal other people. See, he also said that as a Christian, as a pastor, there's a verse in the Bible where it mentions that a person went to hell because they had money and didn't give it to Lazarus, who was poor. And he said America also will go to hell if it doesn't use its wealth to help its poor. So when we talk about him, we often think that he died just because a racist shot him, but it's not lost on me and historians that in all of the things he got passed and done, the only time they got to him, the only time he really was injured, shot, killed, was when he started talking about economy, economic policy, economics, on the side of the poor people, unions, socialization. These ideas, especially in the 60s, were dangerous. And as you'll hear in this absolutely amazing documentary we're going to listen to, we're going to talk about while we watch a few photos, while we remember the greatness of this man, I want to talk about just a little bit how important those policies, those ideas were to him. And I'll let the people who marched with him tell that story in their own words as well. And then maybe even we'll have someone join us to talk about where we go from here and how to, and what's happening, what we need to watch for, why we need to stay vigilant, what we fight for, and how we're not allowed to stop fighting or give up in any way. I hope it's informative for you. I hope it opens someone's eyes. And if it doesn't open your eyes, maybe you can share this. It's live now, but of course it'll be up forever. Maybe you can share it with someone who thinks that maybe unions, socialism, economic policy are things that we don't need to worry about. And you can let them know how much he worried about it and the real reason he died. Let's take a listen. We're going to go here to apmreports.org, free channel, so I hope everything is okay when we play it. But have a listen to what the people around him had to say.
From American Public Media, this is King's Last March. I'm Stephen Smith. It has been 50 years since Martin Luther King Jr. was killed on the balcony of his hotel room in Memphis. 50 years ago, King wasn't supposed to be on that balcony. He wasn't even supposed to be in Memphis. But the reason he was there was fundamental to all that he held dear in the final year of his life. In spring 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. got diverted from his work on the Poor People's Campaign by a garbage strike in Tennessee.
City Hall this afternoon and demanded Mayor Henry Loeb hear their grievances. The workers are striking for higher pay. Many receive only the federal minimum wage.
For the sake of accuracy, I want to make sure you hear the name of the campaign and who he was fighting for.
In spring 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. got diverted from his work on the Poor People's Campaign by a garbage strike in Tennessee.
To City Hall this afternoon and demanded Mayor Henry Loeb hear their grievances. The workers are striking for higher pay. Many receive only the federal minimum wage.
Black sanitation workers were protesting against miserable working conditions. For years, they carried garbage from backyard trash cans in round steel tubs on their heads. Many tubs leaked. The men drank water from a cooler on the truck because they weren't allowed to stop for refreshment. Sometimes they found maggots in their drinking cups.
They were persistently mistreated.
The Reverend James Lawson led a local civil rights movement that supported the striking trash collectors.
They were persistently called racist names by their white supervisors. They were often called boy. They had no way to work for promotion.
And they were treated as disposable laborers. They had no pensions, no vacations. They had nothing, and if they got hurt, then they were just out of a job.
Historian Michael Honey says the garbage workers put up with the wretched conditions until 1968, when two of their own suffered a gruesome accident. In Memphis, black trash haulers were not allowed to ride in the truck's cab with white workers. So when it rained, they often climbed in the back where the garbage cans got emptied. In back was also where the trash got crushed by a powerful blade.
On February 1st, Ethel Cole and Robert Walker, 36 and 30 years old, were riding in the back, and the mechanism went off and went into action. The driver stopped the truck, but by the time he got out of the truck, the packing mechanism had grabbed them and mashed them just like garbage, and they were killed instantly.
We have a chat going. Please
Black workers
leave the
decided
chat
to strike.
I'll say hello.
But city officials refused to bargain with them. And when peaceful demonstrators marched to City Hall,
If you
police
see that,
attacked
you're in the
them with
right
tear
place.
gas and billy clubs. A month into the strike, James Lawson asked King to come to Memphis to boost morale. King arrived on March 18, 1968, and spoke to a massive crowd at the Mason Temple, a Pentecostal church.
Now let me say a word to those of you who are on strike. You've been out now for a number of days, but don't despair.
King told the workers to hold on, even though the white residents of Memphis seemed to be ignoring their struggle. King said it was like a Bible story.
Jesus reminded us in a magnificent parable one day that a man went to hell because he didn't see the poor. His name was Dives.
Dives went to hell for ignoring a beggar named Lazarus.
And I come by here to say that America too is going to hell if she doesn't use her wealth.
That's right.
America does not use her vast resources of wealth to end poverty.
Okay. Here's point number one. When he said America too is going to hell if it doesn't use its vast wealth to end poverty, that was the day that those in his circle, those in power, knew that he would be dead very soon. I'm not just saying that. I'm going to let you hear when the people around him, said that. You see, because there's the idea of social equality is really, really hard for the everyday white person in the South to accept, because they had never seen it before. They thought it was dirty. They thought it was unreal. It could never happen. They didn't want to be seen as the same. But the people in power see less about skin color and more about the color of the dollar. Green, that pale green and white. That sifty, sandy paper, minted on this continent, was what they see the most. And they, for a very long time, have been in charge of the people in charge for a very long time. It happens till today. We're going to try to talk about it briefly, but I want you to understand that that moment, that mention that America is going to hell if it doesn't use its wealth to take care of the poor, was the day he sealed his fate. That was the real reason. The people in power wouldn't let it stand.
Make it possible for all of God's children to have the basic necessities of life. She too will go to hell.
At first, King didn't plan to do more in Memphis than give this speech. In fact, his staff at the SCLC didn't want him to go at all. Andrew Young ran the organization's daily operations. Young feared that Memphis would be a troublesome detour on the road to the SCLC's Poor People's March in Washington.
We were stretched awful thin, and we were doing an awful lot. And yet people wanted him to be everywhere and to do everything. But we had very little money and very little trained staff to help do it.
King understood from the beginning that it was kind of like the story of the Good Samaritan.
Historian Claiborne Carson.
If he failed to stop and help this campaign of sanitation workers in Memphis, then he would be like the priest who walked by the person on the roadside who needed help. Instead, he wanted to be the Good Samaritan who went to Memphis and helped those who were desperately in need of outside help and attention.
The thing for you to do is stay together. Say to everybody in this community that you're going to stick it out to the end until every demand is met, and that you're going to say, we ain't going to let nobody turn us around.
King's visit to Memphis lifted morale among the strikers and their supporters, but it was also a tonic for King. At the time, King was struggling to recruit people for the Washington March, and his popularity seemed to be ebbing. But the Mason Temple was one of the largest gathering places for black people in the South, and as many as 14,000 packed the place to hear King speak.
You know what? You may have to escalate the struggle a bit.
Historian Michael Honey.
At the end of this speech, King is trying to find an ending to his speech. He hesitates for a minute, and then he says,
I tell you what you ought to do, and you're together here enough to do it.
Here it is.
In a few days, you ought to get together and just have a general work stoppage in the city of Memphis.
That was it. That was when it happened. When he said, stick together, he's talking about a union for black workers before it ever existed. Their own union, developed by themselves, with him or whoever in the community as a leader. Everyone had to stop working for a day. When he said that, he sealed his fate. It wasn't the marching for equal rights. It wasn't the marching for desegregation. It wasn't the marching for voting rights. It was the minute he said every black person should not show up to work one day to remind the people who pay them their worth. And that day, he sealed his fate, as we're going to find out. Please, people understand the importance of economic policy, of the things that matter when it comes to equality in economics. How important it was. If you don't think it's important, understand that he had gotten all of those other things I mentioned done before being assassinated, until he mentioned, don't go to work. One day, band together. One day, don't give up. That day, he sealed his fate. Check it out.
you'll hear then bedlam, just people shouting and yelling, and it goes on for several minutes like you'd hit a home run. And the reason for this is that black people in Memphis had always done most of the labor, the maids, the people on the waterfront, the railroads, and they knew that if they all stopped work on a given day, they could close the city down.
And you let that day come. Not a Negro in this city will go to any job downtown.
Oh boy, that's
And
dangerous.
there haven't been very many general strikes in American labor history, and none in the civil rights movement era. So this would have been a tremendous high watermark for the movement.
King promised the strikers in Memphis he would come back soon and help reach that high watermark. Instead, when he returned, King would endure one of the lowest days of his civil rights career.
Dr. Martin Luther King's massive downtown march on Memphis is now underway. Several thousand Negroes are marching toward City Hall at this time.
March 28, 1968. King is back in Memphis. This time he's accompanied by just 2 of his staffers from the SCLC.
Many of the demonstrators are carrying the sign, "I am a man." They stretch out for several blocks. Police are on hand with about 600 officers. Almost the entire force is standing by here in case any trouble might break out.
Though King steps up to lead the protest march, he's counting on local organizers to keep the demonstration orderly. Michael Honey says King is obviously uneasy as he's pushed along by the crowd.
You can see in the photography of the march that Dr. King is visibly exhausted.
I don't have.
His
This
head
is not the
falling from
photography
side to
of that
side.
march.
He looks
It's
dazed.
just a
He looks
slideshow in
apprehensive.
commemoration of the
He's
human.
not feeling like he's really in control of the situation, and he really isn't.
Chaos has just broken out downtown. Chaos has just broken out downtown. All right. Negro youths are smashing windows.
The violence begins in the crowd behind King as he and the march leaders turn a corner into Memphis's main street. Local organizer James Lawson was with King.
I see up here on Main Street a phalanx of police in riot gear across the street.
That sound you just heard was the sound of a tear gas fired by a police officer in an attempt to thwart this unruly demonstration.
Lawson says he saw a dozen or so young people breaking storefront windows, but the riot police weren't interested in them.
And I point up the street and they say they're going to break the march up.
Police have formed a cordon across Main Street at this time in an attempt to at least calm the demonstration, which has gotten completely out of hand. The Negro youths are shouting at this time, "Go, go."
James Lawson's response was, Martin, they're coming for you, the police. Secondly, you can't be in the position of leading a march that turns into violence. So Lawson got him out of the march, and King protested because he knew that people would say he ran and so forth, which the news media did say.
Was that Martin Luther King? He has deserted the march.
He's deserted the march, they said. Can you imagine that?
We're waiting on the rest of
The violence continued for hours as peaceful marchers got caught up in the same police counterattack as looters. One teenager was shot to death. Dozens of protesters were injured. And
If you can
nearly
hear it,
300
please let
black
me
people
know.
arrested.
If you can't hear it, let me know.
Stores in the black section of town got looted and burned. Martin Luther King was despondent. He crawled into bed at his Memphis hotel with his clothes on, trying to sort out what had gone wrong and what to do next. He spent the evening with SCLC staff who had hurried to Memphis.
Never had I seen him so upset and disturbed.
Ralph Abernathy was King's second in command at the SCLC. Abernathy was interviewed in the late 1980s.
Dr. King was heartbroken because he didn't want to lead a violent march. He wanted his record to be clear. And he said to me, why don't we just step aside and let the violent forces run their course? Because they will soon run out. And I said to him, no, Martin, we will remain nonviolent and we will be actively engaged in nonviolent activities.
I actively dispute.
Violence is not the way. We cannot ever be free.
I actively
violence.
dispute that
King
account from
talked and
Abernathy. He's
fretted
been known
late
to
into the night.
embellish
Next morning, he
and make
held a press
himself look
conference,
good
hoping
before.
to control the damage to his reputation
Just being honest.
and to his plans for the Poor People's Campaign. Reporters challenged King on whether he could keep the Washington demonstration peaceful.
This gentleman.
How do you turn this on and off? You suggest people of a violent nature can suddenly be made non-violent.
Well, you must remember that most Negroes
Of a
have
violent
never
nature.
accepted philosophical credo nonviolence. But most Negroes are willing to follow tactical nonviolence. I saw this in Chicago when we were working there. We had Blackstone Rangers marching with us, the worst gang in Chicago. They never retaliated with violence. Now, certainly they believed in violence, but they at least accepted tactical nonviolence for particular demonstrations.
Quick explanation. If you don't know what the Blackstone Rangers are, some were called Peastone Rangers. The Peastones, Blackstones also turned into portions of the Black Panthers after a while. And these were Chicago gangs that also have morphed into what we call today the Vice Lords, as well as some are GDs, Gangster Disciples, and they've changed their names many times. But that's who he's talking about. The Chicago gangs that were way more organized back then than they are now. He said even they realized the benefits of tactical nonviolence. So when you hear someone tell you that, well, he was just all about peace, even he said, Martin Luther King, that is, he developed the idea of tactical nonviolence through watching and reading the history and studying Gandhi and how it worked in getting the British out of India. That's why they use nonviolence, not because you didn't have a right to be violent, or not because you shouldn't be angry enough to be violent. But when the people who will write laws that will crush you and crush us, poor people, black people, people of color, people without power. The nonviolence he was talking about wasn't from a nice heart. It was a tactical use of getting what you wanted by showing others who may also have a heart how bad it really was. Because the minute you used violence, they could then dismiss you because they want to. That's why. It wasn't because he was nice. Remember that. Tactical nonviolence. It only served a purpose. And if it didn't serve that purpose, understand there was another way. Let's continue.
And an organized thrust.
King said that at the Memphis March, local organizers had failed to make sure that young black militants accepted tactical nonviolence. But King's critics leapt on the disastrous march as a sign of his fading authority.
The worst part of it was that King had never led a demonstration in which violence broke out among his followers.
Michael Honey.
And he knew also that the FBI and the news media now would go on the attack against him as a leader and against the Poor People's Campaign. All the national news media fed releases by the FBI began to say King ran like a rabbit and was scared, and he set up the situation. Every place he goes, violence happens, then he claims to be a nonviolent leader. His ability to lead a march on Washington is clearly threatened.
When he got home to Atlanta, King told his staff at the SCLC that there was no choice. He would have to return to Memphis.
Yes.
King said he had to prove he could lead a nonviolent demonstration in Memphis before moving on to Washington.
Yes.
And then some on the staff objected, but King was adamant. Next time on King's Last March.
Okay,
His
so
last days.
that was that.
But I'm not concerned about that now.
That was that. I think I've said all I needed to say. Hopefully you've heard it all. Rewind it if you need to hear it again. But the idea was, it wasn't just anti-racism, anti-segregation that got him killed. The real reason was that the moment he told poor people, not black people, poor people, to organize to fight back against an economic power, to gain some of that for themselves. He sealed his fate. The minute he said America was going to hell if it didn't use its wealth to lift people out of poverty, it was then that he sealed his fate. That's the most important takeaway from all of this. We can talk about tactical nonviolence another time, but this day, this is what we're fighting for. This is what the modern movement is still fighting for, or needs to be fighting for, if it doesn't think it is. Because those same people in power still hold the reins. Second half.
From American Public Media, this is King's Last March. I'm Stephen Smith.
Please check it out.
In our final chapter, the events that played out 50 years ago this week. Martin Luther King Jr. was back in Memphis, this time with a full team of SCLC organizers. It was April 3rd, 1968.
Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. says a federal court order will not prevent him from holding a second mass march in Memphis. U.S. District Court Judge Bailey Brown issued the temporary restraining order shortly after King returned to Memphis, with plans announced for a huge mass march next Monday. King said in these words, "We are not going to be stopped by mace or injunctions or any other method that the city plans to use." He termed the injunction a basic denial of First Amendment privileges.
A mass meeting was planned that night at the Mason Temple. A heavy storm rumbled into Memphis and threatened to keep people home. King didn't feel well, but was talked into speaking. The storm rattled windows and rain beat down on the church's metal roof. Without notes, King talked about the history of civil rights, about the power of the poor to rise up, and how grateful he was to have lived in the freedom struggle.
Now it doesn't matter now. It really doesn't matter what happens now. I left Atlanta this morning, and as we got started on the plane, there were 6 of us. The pilot said over the public address system, "We are sorry for the delay, but we have Dr. Martin Luther King on the plane, and to be sure that all of the bags were checked, and to be sure that nothing would be wrong on the plane, we had to check out everything carefully, and we've had the plane protected and guarded all night." And then I got into Memphis, and some began to say the threats, or talk about the threats that were out. What would happen to me from some of our sick white brothers? Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult a long life, longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried.
Somebody asked me, why did I start Political Drain? I already had a channel doing very well that I had to kind of neglect to get this started. Almost 40,000 followers. I had another channel started with doing just music, what I love, and that was doing well and still doing well, is growing. And they said, why did I start Political Drain? Why am I up every night and I can't see my wife sometimes because it's that important? And I said, because I don't have a right not to fight. I don't have a right to not fulfill that promise. He knew he was gone. He knew he was gone. And he said, I may not get there with you, but we will get there. And I don't have a right not to fight until we do. That's why I started it. That's why every 29 views is important to me. And that's why I will never stop. Someone else said to me, they said, you know, bringing your son into a place like this, you had another kid, you know, bringing them into a place like this, do you feel like maybe you shouldn't have? And I said, no, because he now has the legacy. Maybe one day his name will be written in the history book. Maybe one day, now he has the right and the privilege to write his name in the book of freedom, of equality. That's why I don't have the right not to fight. I don't have the right to have a YouTube channel, a platform, a voice, or a life that doesn't in some way further the call. I suggest neither do you. Let's continue.
About anything, I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
King spent the next day, April 4th, 1968, in Memphis at the Lorraine Motel. Andrew Young was down at the federal courthouse fighting the injunction. King huddled with other SCLC officials to plan strategy. He shared a plate of fried catfish with Ralph Abernathy. He talked with his brother and parents on the phone. In the late afternoon, Young returned from court. The march could go forward. King pretended to be sore that Young had failed to call him all day.
And he picked up a pillow off the bed and he threw it at me. You know, I just threw it back playfully. And then all of a sudden, everybody picked up pillows, and it didn't take long before, with the two double beds in this motel, they put me down between the two beds and piled pillows on top of them.
Again, Abernathy shows he wasn't the one.
Middle-aged men almost having a pillow fight like children.
When the rumpus subsided, King and the others got ready to go to dinner. King stood on the motel balcony and called down to a young musician who would be playing saxophone at a mass meeting that night. King asked him to play his favorite gospel song, Precious Lord, Take My Hand. Ralph Abernathy was in the hotel room putting on cologne. Andrew Young urged King to go back in and get a topcoat.
He was sort of standing there saying, you know, thinking out loud, I'm not sure I need a coat.
And I heard what sounded like a firecracker.
My first reaction was that he'd been so playful and he was clowning again, that he had staggered back into the room and that this was a firecracker, a car backfiring.
I saw only his feet laying on the balcony.
The bullet had hit him and knocked him out of his shoes.
And I kneeled down and took his head up in my hand.
And by the time we climbed up the steps to where he was,
and I started patting his cheek.
And he was laying there in his own blood,
saying, Martin, 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 don't be afraid, don't be afraid.
It was obvious that this was the end.
It will be all right.
I don't think he ever heard the shot.
And at that time, he relaxed.
It pierced the tip of his chin and cut his spinal cord in half.
He became very, very calm.
And the bullet probably got there before the sound. And that was it.
His eyes softly closed. And he heard me. And he believed me that it would be all right.
The heart of America grieves today.
President Lyndon Johnson spoke to the nation.
A leader of his people and a teacher of all people has fallen. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. has been struck down by the violence against which he preached and worked. Yet the cause for which he struggled has not fallen.
In retrospect, some of King's closest friends believed that in the last year of his life, King knew that an assassin of some kind was creeping closer. But historian Claiborne Carson says King was more worried by violence in the nation's ghettos than the threat against himself.
There was a real sense in King's mind that the end might be near, but he was beyond worrying about that. He truly believed that it was necessary to take whatever risk to see it through, to try the best you can to head off what he felt would be a bloodbath in the United States.
Nationwide slum rioting unleashed by the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King has claimed more than 30 lives and
Thank you, Bill.
into countless millions.
More than 100 American cities exploded in violence when King was assassinated. In a way King never would have wanted, his death forced America to see the fury of its poor people, however briefly and however from a distance.
Out of the windows in the project.
I just want to say again, what the man said was so important. He wanted them to see the plight of the poor people. It wasn't just the buses, the voting rights, the bathrooms, and the water fountains. It wasn't just black people. He knew the most powerful people, the ones who could do the most damage or good, were those who made the economic policies. Because we just so happen to live in a capitalist society. Whether or not you like it doesn't matter. But the ones who hold the chains, the ones who hold the key to unlock the chains, are one and the same. They are the same ones who hold the politicians and the sanitary worker. The school doors and the janitor. And they're not the person you think they are. Tonight they're voting in Iowa. Donald Trump will more than likely, obviously, win the Republican nomination. I'm sorry, Laura. I wanted to talk about it. And there's a lot more going on in Florida. Hopefully we can do it tomorrow. I don't think I can go any further and talk about anything else, except for the fact that the reason we fight is because the promised land was seen, and if we stop fighting, we make Dr. King a liar, and I refuse to do that till my last breath. I refuse to stop. My job, my only job, is to ensure that he remains the truth teller that he was supposed to be and was. It's to raise my kids to be the truth tellers. And it's to bring every one of you along with me to the promised land. Because if I'm not doing that, I don't deserve to be here. We're going to finish this out. It's not just black, white, Asian. The hate is real. It's driven by money. All of it. All of it. If we can just do one thing, remember one thing, vote for one thing, fight for one thing, it's economic equality, because that's what loosens the chains. And he knew that, and they killed him for it.
Lasting and enduring. 3,000 National Guardsmen are on the street in Chicago tonight. At least 3 persons are dead. Florida A&M students enraged by the sniper slaying of Martin Luther King went on a shooting and burning rampage here in Tallahassee.
Yes, he did,
this morning.
Bill.
One white teenager was killed and at least 14 others were injured.
And you're right, Laura.
Most of the bullets and firebombs fell in urban black neighborhoods. 2 months later, an escaped convict, a white man named James Earl Ray, was arrested. Ray was a small-time robber who confessed to shooting King, but then recanted. His motives and guilt remain controversial.
We had been trained not to worry about who killed Martin Luther King. We knew that that was irrelevant.
Andrew Young.
The question was, what is it about our society that makes it necessary to take the life of a man of
Yes,
peace,
Laura.
a man of honor,
On behalf of
integrity,
all people
a
without
man who's
power.
only trying to make America a better place.
King's colleagues pressed on with a Poor People's March on Washington in May of 1968, but the event was a disaster. Relentless rains turned their shantytown on the National Mall into a muddy sinkhole. The protest was largely ignored by Congress and the news media. And the American Civil Rights Movement was already in deep disarray before King was killed. Vincent Harding, King's friend and advisor, says King knew the movement was faltering. So in the last year of his life, King chose the path of deeper difficulty and greater risk.
King chose to be one with the poor, and you cannot, in a materialistic society, be one with the poor unless you are turning your face against the mainstream of the society. That's what we mean by becoming more radical, that you become someone who Mr. J. Edgar Hoover can call the most dangerous Negro in America.
Martin Luther King Jr. was buried in his Atlanta neighborhood near Ebenezer Baptist Church. To symbolize King's dedication to the lives and rights of poor people, a wooden farm wagon pulled by mules carried his casket to the grave.
It's called King's Last March. Writers Kate Ellis and Stephen Smith. You can find it on apmreports.org. There were 3 other parts that I didn't show. Most important part to me is for us to remember that what we're fighting for goes beyond black or white. King knew where the power was and who to go after. And we have a duty. We have a duty to ensure that he is not proven to be a liar when he said he saw the promised land. I wanted to have a big thing about what to do next, but I'm not ready for it. Laura Malcolm, you'll see her there. Click on that, join her page. Maybe we can do it tomorrow. Is talking about what's going on in Florida, talking about the vote happening in Iowa. All of these things matter. Don't give up. Don't tune out because it's so bad. It's just another fight. It never ends. And if we think that it ends, that someday we're going to get somewhere we won't have to fight anymore, you're in the wrong business. Life is a fight. There will always be someone to fight against. If you wonder why TYT is doing what it's doing, and you always hear me say, don't just neglect them, it's because without them, there always will be a fight. There's always something else to fight for. There's always something to fight against. And that's what they do. Right now, I think they're a little bit lost. But I guarantee you, it's just because they're looking for another fight and Cenk is running for president. That's okay. We need them. We need them. I need you. You need me. We need those that don't agree. As long as they're fighting. There's no such thing as life without the fight. Only people not fighting are the people eating grapes wearing purple in the Roman castles. That's it. That's it. That's all. That's all there is. Will your name be written? Will my name be written? In that book that records the fight. Part 2. Project 2025 was coming out tomorrow, Tuesday, today, as you see this, if you're not watching live. Obviously, that's not happening. Maybe we can do something with Laura Malcolm. Check her out. That will be coming. It'll probably be on Wednesday. It's going to be pushed back. It'll probably be Wednesday now. You don't want to miss it. If you haven't seen part 1, Project 2025 is so important. It's such a big deal. I try to break it down without big words and lack of understanding. And I try to let you know what's really going on so you too can fight and know what to do. Happy holiday, MLK holiday. We will overcome. We shall overcome. We are not afraid. We are not afraid. We are not afraid today, tomorrow, in the future. Our ancestors were not afraid. Deep in their hearts, they believed that we would be the generation to overcome. And so do I.